Let's look at another Ukraine take then that's been a bit controversial. This is the Stop the War Coalition. Now, for some context for international viewers, Stop the War Coalition is an organization in the UK that was founded around the time of the start of what we now call the War on Terror, well, what was then called the War on Terror 2, around the time of the invasion of Afghanistan, very notably opposed the Iraq War. There was a massive demonstration in London against the Iraq War back just before it happened. Stop the War was pivotal behind that. At the same time, there are more problematic aspects to Stop the War. I think we're about to look at some of those now. So let's look at their statement from the 22nd of February, 2022. This is 2 days before the invasion fully started. Stop the War condemns the movement of Russian forces into eastern Ukraine and urges that they immediately withdraw alongside the resumption of diplomatic negotiations to resolve the crisis. This dispute could and should be resolved peacefully, and that remains the only basis for a lasting settlement rather than the imposition of military solutions. What do we make of this?
I think there's a couple of problematic parts of this statement.
Yeah, I haven't read the full thing out yet. I think there's more to come.
Yeah. I mean, I know that you and Kit Roberts have touched on this a little bit in a previous redaction report episode, and I mean, for me, just looking at a couple of the opening lines, for me, one of the ones that stands out is the fact that this is not the responsibility of the Russian or Ukrainian governments alone. And I think I appreciate the sentiment of that. I appreciate that it's trying to say, you know, that the statement is trying to convey that this is a world problem, and this is a problem that the world needs to tackle. And I hope that's the main meaning behind it. But to remove any responsibility of this from the Russian government just seems to me as the completely wrong approach to this. That there's no one else responsible for this apart from the Russian government and Vladimir Putin, and they should be held responsible for everything that's happening now. All the children that are being bombed in theaters in Mariupol, the people, Ukrainian people who are starving in cities, to somehow place that on NATO, I think is a ridiculous statement. You know, I think Ukraine, NATO membership is part of Ukraine's constitution. It should have every right to be part of that alliance if it wants to. Of course, whether it will or not is another question. But the idea that it has the possibility to choose its own fate, I think is a really, really powerful one, which I think NATO should be defending, and Stop the War Coalition should be defending too. And, you know, fully appreciate their point of view, diplomacy before anything else. But when it comes to a situation where you've been invaded by an aggressive neighbor who is, according to reports, actively targeting civilians who are unarmed, starving cities, then I think removing any responsibility away from the Russian government or military is completely the wrong way to go about this. And it's quite frankly an awful take on the situation. Just my view on the opening, one of the opening lines anyway. There's more, which which isn't great.
There's a lot to unpack here, as they say. Yes, I think you're quite right there. Let's be clear. There's plenty to criticize in NATO. Let's not pretend that there's not a dark side to NATO's history. At the same time, that's irrelevant here. And that's the bottom line. NATO is not to blame for what's happening in Ukraine right now. Certainly, there's only one leader who's responsible for what's going on. That is Vladimir Putin. NATO expansion did not force him to invade Ukraine. The Eastern European countries that joined NATO since the end of the Cold War joined so of their own volition. This is not some imperialist project. This is not some grand conspiracy. They joined NATO because they wanted to be part of a defensive alliance against the country under whose subjugation they had been since the end of the Second World War. That's the context we've got to consider here. The Baltic states, which were part of the Soviet Union, are part of NATO. Other old Warsaw Pact countries, such as Poland, are in NATO. There's nothing controversial in suggesting that Ukraine should be a NATO member.
Not at all. It's almost like the more I think of it, the worse it gets. It's almost pandering to some kind of, Russian imperial dreams of greater Russia again, to take away responsibility from the Russian government.
Well, that's been the whole idea of the eastern and southern Ukraine provinces, as this whole idea of Novorossiya, isn't it?
Reclaiming that kind of Russian land, which they think is theirs. And yeah, anyway, hugely problematic start to that. Another part of this I don't really like is a little bit further down, about halfway through, they encourage a return to the Minsk II agreement. And again, I just want to point this out because I think this is a problem now, because the conditions of the Minsk II agreement should have stopped any kind of conflict happening between Russia and Ukraine. That was the whole point of it in the first place. There can be no returning to that agreement now. The reason Ukraine signed up to that agreement, which essentially allowed there to be a kind of no man's land in the Donbass between Russia and Ukraine, with troops on both sides. Essentially, Ukrainian territory has Russian troops on it. The only reason that was signed was to stop something like what we've got happen now, where Ukrainian cities are being bombed, civilians are being killed. The fact that that's happened, the fact that Ukrainians are now under attack from all sides, from an aggressive Russian army, they can never go back to now a situation, in my opinion, where Russian soldiers occupy part of Ukraine. Because otherwise, what was the point in it? What did all those people die for? Why did we? We could have done something like that ages ago, but we didn't. That was supposed to stop what's happened now. So I think that's a really problematic thing to say, that when that agreement's been violated by Russia, that we go back to that and we just sort of pretend everything's okay, because it's not now. It won't be like that again. The world has changed from this event. Russia's actions will have huge consequences for the whole of Russia, for the world, even. And going back to something like that, where Ukrainian territory remains to be occupied by Russian troops, I don't think any Ukrainian would want to sign up for that.
Absolutely not. Ultimately, what we're seeing here with this Stop the War statement is a wrongful, a misguided both sides of the issue. And it's not the first time we see this in big political debates, and it won't be the last either, but it's got to be called out when it's there. We've got to be abundantly clear about what's happening in Ukraine. It's purely a war of aggression on the part of Russia. And it's one of the things that's so utterly tragic about the Ukraine war, is that it's such a pointless war. What are all these, both Ukrainian civilians, Ukrainian soldiers, and Russian soldiers, what are they dying for? What are they dying for? They're just dying for one sad little dictator's dreams of empire. Yeah, utterly tragic.
We have seen reports on social media of Russian soldiers, a very small minority of actually giving up, surrendering, not going to fight. And I don't blame them. I really, really don't blame them. Imagine imagine you're a Russian soldier and you're taken from your home and you're sent to Ukraine and told to attack people who, most of them speak the same language as you. The culture is, it's not the same, but it's similar. Most Ukrainians probably have some sort of Russian family somewhere. Lots of Russian people have Ukrainian family too. I just can't imagine being a soldier and being sent over and being told, go and attack these people, and just following that order. So yeah, I understand why Russian soldiers are some Russian soldiers, a minority of them, are not following orders, and why there's been reports of that. I think this is probably one of the reasons why Russia didn't achieve its aims in Ukraine straight away, because I can't imagine there's very much motivation among the Russian army to do this, to risk their life to take Mariupol, or, you know, to take Kharkiv. I don't see what the motivation is for them. What do they get from that? Very, very little, if anything, compared to the motivation of the Ukrainian army, which is defending its homeland. So, yeah, I think that's going to be a big part of this conflict, this war, as it goes on too.
Anyway, let's spare ourselves with more bad Ukraine takes now.
Agree.
If you want to learn a bit more about Ukraine, please consider watching the first episode of our show, our limited edition podcast on Ukrainian history. You can find it on our YouTube channel. Just follow the links below. We'll be putting more episodes out on that in due course. We've got some really interesting topics lined up. We're going to be looking at the history of Ukraine and the Soviet Union, at the history of the Kiev and Rus, at the history of Ukrainians' Jewish community, and even more to come over the coming months. So please keep tabs on that. And of course, we're doing all of that as part of a fundraiser for Save the Children. Again, link in the description. Please consider donating.